The United Nations is contemplating a global internet tax that would require some of the world's largest online content providers to pay to continue their global reach. Leaked documents from the European Telecommunications Network Operators Association indicate that this proposal could hit companies such as Google, Facebook, and Apple. European network providers have reportedly been unhappy with U.S.-based content providers for some time now and are hoping that this initiative could amend an existing telecommunications treaty. Although the issue is not set to be debated until December at the World Conference on International Telecommunications, alarms are already ringing in the U.S. as people fear the UN may attempt to take over the Internet. And author and technology consultant Larry Downs is joining us now by way of phone to talk about this proposal and just how concerned the U.S. should be about it. Thanks for being with us today, Larry.
Pleasure as always.
Well, great. Well, there is a lot to get into regarding this issue, but first of all, just help us understand what the proposal is about. What exactly does it entail?
Sure. This proposal is part of, as you mentioned, a long process that's going on this year leading up to a treaty negotiation at the end of the year. Mm-hmm. And the particular proposal that was leaked asks that the treaties be changed so that we implement what's called a sending network party pays institution for the Internet. And what that would mean is that when a user, let's say in a European country or even in a developing nation country, asks for certain content, let's say, a Google search or YouTube video or something like that, that the bits that come across from a U.S.-based website to that user be charged effectively a tax for the privilege of reaching that user. Now, this changes the whole structure of really how the Internet works and has worked successfully up until now. Really, the way it works now is that the large communications networks have what are called peering arrangements in place, and that largely nets out so that, in fact, my traffic and your traffic are treated the same. We don't pay each other, and essentially, you charge your users for access, I charge my users for access, and that's how, as a network operator, I make money.
So how much money are we looking at with this tax? Do you have an estimate?
Well, we can sort of analogize. We don't have a number because one of the problems, of course, with this whole UN process is these proposals are very vague, and frankly, they're secret. This one leaked out. Others will be leaking out as the course of the year. But this treaty negotiation is a secret treaty, and none of the participants are supposed to be sharing these proposals outside of the immediate parties, the 193 countries who are negotiating it, and then the non-voting members who pay a significant amount of money just to sit in on the process. So this particular proposal was very vague about what that tax would look like and how big it would be. But we know the previous treaty that we have in place from the International Telecommunications Union, which is the agency of the UN that's involved here, they've had a treaty in place for really over 100 years, but the most recent version dealt with international long-distance phone charges. And a very similar system was put in place where countries could charge, essentially, they could set the price of what an international long-distance call coming into their country would cost. So, it used to be if you were the United States and you were trying to call India or Mexico or even France, the per-minute rate you would pay would be based on what the carrier on the other side set as that per-minute rate. And, of course, these were in the days when most telephone companies were national companies. They were owned by the government. Some of them still are. Some of them are now partly privatized, and some of them are fully privatized. But in the days of these international phone calls, we had countries essentially charging as much as $1 a minute for long distance. This, of course, was way more than it actually cost them to handle the call. They claimed that it was there to help them build out their infrastructure to sort of, be on the same par with developed nations. But the reality is they didn't do that. They just took, the money went into the normal, kind of kleptocracy process where it was stolen by various government officials and various forms of graft and corruption. And in the sort of the height of this, the United States reported that in a particularly bad year in the 1990s, the United States paid a net of $15 billion. That is to say, U.S. consumers paid $15 billion to place long-distance international phone calls more than what was paid on the other end for calls coming into the United States. So it's that kind of an imbalance that we're talking about. And it could be, of course, that was in phone calls. Imagine now we're talking about data, which is much more intense use of bandwidth. It could be much, much more than that.
Wow. Well, now the lobbying organization ETNO that is behind this, why are they so adamant on this?
Well, the ETNO represents a large group of European telecommunications companies, many of them wireless companies, and frankly, the Europeans are concerned that most of the successful content-based business of the internet is all in the United States. We don't have the, sort of the equivalent of YouTube or eBay or Apple in Europe, or certainly not in the developing world, and so they see this as one way of kind of getting their pound of flesh out of the very successful U.S. internet industry. Frankly, it's little more than that. It's essentially just a money grab. They see the UN as the opportunity to put that in the form of an international treaty, and therefore with the force of law behind it, to make it easily collectible.
Well, the leaked documents, which are available at wikileaks.org, make reference to a principle of sending party network pays, which you brought up earlier, and also suggest a commercial arrangement between players. What exactly does this language mean?
So what they're trying to do is essentially change the bargaining terms under which these peering arrangements between networks are established. So right now, let's say the big backbone companies in the United States, AT&T, Verizon, Level 3, and others, when they want to send traffic to the other parts of the world, they have in place various arrangements, legal arrangements, contracts, most of them, by the way, also secret, where they establish what the peering arrangements are with traffic going one way and traffic going the other way. What ETNO hopes to do with this proposal is essentially restart all those negotiations and start with, again, the legal principle that all the traffic coming from the sending party would be charged as if it was an international long-distance call. That is to say, we would set the rate, we, the European telcos, we would set the per-bit rate or the per-minute rate or whatever unit they decide on. We'll set what that rate is, and then under this treaty, you as the U.S. Telco company, and therefore your customers, the big content providers, and then therefore their customers, the actual consumers, would somehow have to come up with this money in various forms. It could be, higher fees for content. It could be, higher fees for communications access. It could be all sorts of things. But ultimately, whatever that fee is that the receiving country sets for its receiving power would be passed along ultimately to not just to U.S. consumers, but by the way, would also be passed on to the consumers of those telephone companies. Because, of course, if Google has to pay billions of dollars to get their content to consumers in Europe who ask for it, they're going to have to figure out, well, what do I do? Do I start charging for that? Do I have to set higher ad rates? Do I have to look at countries that their users don't really give me any value in return? That is, they don't click on ads or they can't buy stuff. This is more the developing nations. They may decide that if, say a country in Africa sets a ridiculously high rate on this, that it's not worth it to send content to their citizens. And so the net effect may be that some countries, particularly in the developing world, get cut off altogether from the most valuable content.
Right. I want to get into that in just a minute. But as far as the existing treaty, does it reference the unmetered, the current system that the Internet is using now?
No, because the current version of the treaty was negotiated in the 1980s, and there was no commercial Internet then. And indeed, up until now, this treaty, which, as I said at the beginning, has been around for about 100 years. It started out as a telegraph treaty, then it became a telephone treaty, and that's really what it's been throughout the 20th century. The UN now, the International Telecommunications Union, clearly wants to expand their authority into the Internet, into essentially broadband and bits and data traffic and video traffic. But up till now, that organization has done nothing, literally nothing, having to do with the Internet.
Do you think that it needs to include anything with the Internet?
Absolutely not. No. The current process by which the Internet is governed is really a remarkable example of what's called the multi-stakeholder process. We've got, the organizations like the Internet Society, which are the engineering groups that actually establish the protocols, and, the addressing scheme and the naming conventions and all that stuff is run by engineers, and that's where it should be run. They're fast. They're non-political. They get stuff done quickly. They implement it quickly. Imagine if we turned any part of that governance structure over to any government, but certainly of all governments, the United Nations, which, can't decide anything. They're still negotiating a treaty about the use of outer space and the use of the deep sea. They've been negotiating those treaties since the 1960s and still haven't finished them. Now imagine if we're waiting for the UN to, let's say, put in IP version 6, which we just did successfully without any government involvement. It would be years before the UN would allow, any kind of change of that nature going through their extremely, burdensome processes.
Right. Well, I understand that the timing of this proposal is especially significant since there is also talk of revising the international telecommunications regulations. So how does all of this tie together, and where does it put the U.S.?
So the International Telecommunications Regulations, known as the ITRs, that is the treaty that we're talking about. It's funny because it's called, the Telecommunications Regulation, but really that document is the treaty. And as I said, it was last negotiated in the 1980s. Okay. What's happening in December is a new version of that treaty, a new version of the ITRs, is going to be decided. And then, of course, the 193 member countries of the United Nations will vote, and every country gets the same vote. The U.S. gets the same vote as any other country in that process. So once the new version of the ITRs, that is, once the new treaty has been decided, well, then, of course, it goes back to all 193 countries to their various different processes for approving treaties. In the United States, that means the United States Senate would have to ratify it by a two-thirds vote for it to become, have the force of U.S. law. And many people are saying, look, we don't need to worry about this. Even if the UN, there's various coalitions that are trying to kind of take over this process and come up with some very burdensome set of regulations, both for financial reasons, also for reasons of, political repression in some countries, to get money out of the United States, whatever reasons it is. Even if a bad treaty, even if new ITRs come out of this that are bad, well, the United States just won't ratify it. And certainly the White House, the State Department, Congress have all made lots of noise already, even before it started, saying if we don't like the result, we will not ratify it. The problem is that even if the United States isn't a signatory to the new version of the ITRs, these other countries will be. And it's when a U.S. ISP has to negotiate with a developing nation or a European nation's telco to establish these peering arrangements, they're going to have that treaty in their hand, and they're going to say, we don't care if you signed it or not. We are going to negotiate with you based on the rules in this treaty, and the UN can enforce that treaty not against the United States government, but certainly against, U.S. companies.
So this is a very big and very real threat to not only U.S.-based companies, but also the entire Internet.
Yeah, I think that's the most important point. I mean, this particular proposal from ETNO, as I said, it's really just a money grab by some European companies. But the ultimate losers in all of these proposals, both the sort of economic ones as well as the political ones, the real losers will be Internet users. And in some cases, it may be their own customers. It may be the customers of these telephone companies. It may be the citizens of some of these governments that are pushing bad regulations. And I don't want to characterize this as sort of a U.S. against the world kind of issue. This particular proposal does look like that, or it's certainly U.S. versus Europe. But many of the proposals, again, they're all secret, so we only know the ones that have leaked out. But many of these proposals, if implemented, would be incredibly harmful, not just to U.S. consumers and not just to U.S. companies, but to Internet users around the world.
You mentioned the impact on developing countries, and essentially this would mean what we've seen in the Middle East and in Russia and in other developing countries with social media impacting them, their uproars and things like that. This could cease, basically, if such a proposal were to pass.
Yes, no, not this particular particular proposal, I mean, this particular proposal, as I said, the risk for developing nations is that the content companies will say, well, you're not, we can't make any money off you given these extortionary rates we're being charged, and so you'll be cut off. But there are other proposals that are even more worrisome from that standpoint. Countries like Russia, China, Iran, they don't like the Internet. They don't like the free flow of information. And they, of course, spend lots of effort, technologically, engineering-wise, to try and stop things, to try and see things, to try and block content that they don't want. There are many, many proposals out there floating around from some of these countries that say, in the interest of national security or in the interest of fighting terrorism, what we really want the UN's ITU to do is to say that all content coming into our country, all countries, has to go through essentially a national government gatekeeper so that we can, screen it for dangerous content or for, people who are committing crimes or whatever it is. Of course, this is all window dressing. What they're really saying is we would like an off and on switch for all content coming into our country, and we would like the ability to track who is saying what in terms of our own citizens' use of the Internet so that we can more easily, impose repressive regime change on them and arrest people who are speaking out against the government. Things of this nature would never be allowed in this country, but there are many countries where that's not so clear and where they're looking for the ITU as another way of kind of endorsing that activity and even making it easier for them to shut down content or to track and trace who's saying what to whom.
So just to clarify, all of these such proposals are to be debated at the World Conference in December?
That's right.
Wow.
Yeah.
that's
and as
scary.
I say, we've only seen the ones that have leaked out so far. The ITU staff themselves play a role here. They are supposed to, and by the way, there's regional meetings before this where the sort of different regions are supposed to kind of pool their proposals together and debate them, and they try to sort of winnow them down to a manageable number of proposals that will actually be debated in December at the meeting. The ITU will do some of that. In fact, they've already issued a couple of draft documents saying, okay, here's the proposals that seem to be getting the most attention, that kind of thing. But it's really, it's a very secretive process. It's the opposite of transparency here. We don't really know who will decide ultimately which proposals will be voted on in December and how that debate will actually be structured at the meeting itself.
Well, and obviously the big concern is that all of this could lead to the United Nations governance of the Internet. Do you see that being this just being one step in that direction?
Yes, and I think that's the right way to think about it. I mean, obviously, there are, as I said, many countries who are unhappy with the Internet. They're unhappy either because the U.S. and developed world nations are making the most money off it, or they're unhappy because of the way in which information flows outside of the channels that they can control. Whatever reason, there are a lot of countries who have a lot of interest in making sure that the Internet does not continue to operate as successfully from our standpoint as it has. And they're going to do whatever they can to make that happen. The UN and this particular treaty negotiation, that's one step, but even if ultimately the treaty that comes out of the conference in December doesn't do anything bad, they're certainly not going to quit there. They'll continue to look for other opportunities to, either legally or technologically to interfere with the normal development that we like so much of how the Internet ecosystem has evolved.
Is there anything that concerned consumers can do to lobby against this?
Absolutely. I mean, all consumers, in the United States in particular, we should be continuing to not really put pressure because, in fact, our government seems to be saying the right things, but we should certainly, be thankful and grateful and encourage the White House and the State Department and Congress to keep up the pressure on this process to make sure we don't get a bad treaty out of it. Certainly, we should encourage our friends and neighbors in other countries to wake up to the fact that that their own governments, or in some cases their own communications providers, are trying to do things that would be very detrimental to them as consumers, to them as citizens. And if we can sort of get the worldwide Internet user community together, and leak more documents and make clear that we're paying attention and we're not going to stand for this kind of dangerous and short-sighted interference, that will put a lot of pressure on the process and sort of keep the craziest proposals at least off the table.
Well, what's your prediction for how this will play out?
It's very hard to say. Again, because of the secrecy with which the process goes on, nobody really, knows how it will happen, which proposals will make it to the conference, which ones will drop out. But my prediction is that, over the course of the next 6 months, we will see a lot more leaked documents, and people like me will be writing about them and making sure everybody knows what's in them and what they mean and what people are trying to get away with. And hopefully what we'll see is a kind of uprising of Internet users who say, stop messing with the Internet, whether it's the UN or anybody else. It's working just fine. The governance model we have in place is a great one. And the last thing we need to do is to muck with it in the name of politics or economics.
We'll definitely follow this closely. Larry, thank you so much for talking with us and explaining these important issues.
You're very welcome.
And keep watching WebProNews for the very latest in these proceedings. I'm Abby Johnson with this report.